Obviously what I've heard tonight is not at all surprising to me. People who know my case will know that 17 years ago I was working for the intelligence services and I blew the whistle. I blew the whistle on MI6 funding Al-Qaeda operatives in Libya, associates of Osama bin Laden, to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. This was 1996. That operation went wrong and killed innocent people. At that point, of course, I resigned from the service. This was a crazy operation. At the time, we already knew that the Al-Qaeda or Islamic extremism was already being touted by MI5 as the new threat to the West. Gaddafi, on the other hand, had renounced terrorism. So in this operation, we have agents of the British state, MI6 officers, paying our terrorist enemies to assassinate someone who's no longer a threat to British lives. And they did this without the permission of government. Now, to me, that is an absolutely heinous crime. It is worse than murder because it's terrorism, and it's worse than terrorism because it was done with the abuse of the trust we give the intelligence services to work within the rule of law. Now, this was 1996, bear in mind. We saw what happened subsequently to Gaddafi in 2011, and we've seen the effects of the knock-on from that. That the takeover of Libya by elements of Islamic extremists had spread into places like Syria and Iraq. We are responsible for that bombing of Libya. That was another war crime. I don't care that the UN approved it. The people who voted for it were the kind of countries that have no record, often, for human rights, like China. So the people involved in it are still war criminals, basically, but don't ever expect to see them brought to trial. On the other hand, if you talk about their terrorism, as I did, expect to have your life entirely ruined. And don't get me wrong, these people will offer you the carrot first. They don't like having what they see as a lost sheep, an intelligence officer who's not under, a former intelligence officer who's not under control, basically. And so they'll say to you, well, old man, if you just quietly forget all this whistleblowing, and things like that, we'll find you a contract writing a book about something else, as long as you just don't mention this anymore. Now, of course, I blew the whistle for very good reasons. Part of those reasons were reasons of conscience, but I also believe that the world had a right to know that MI6 was going around paying to have people assassinated, that our intelligence services were no better than any other terrorist out there. And in fact, our intelligence services are worse, because they cannot claim the argument of self-defence. My journey has taken me to the law, and the law is not what you think it is. From the word go, we are told that what comes out of Parliament is law. That is not law, it is a statute. It is written in legalese. Legalese is English words, but words which have a different meaning in law dictionaries. The most obvious example I can think of this, by the way, is the word must. When you get your little thing from the post saying you must pay this parking fine, you dutifully think, I have to pay it. Now, up until the 9th edition of Black's Law, the word must was defined as being synonymous with may, to be a possibility that, or to be permitted to. Obviously, when you now read that parking ticket, and it says you are permitted to pay a fine, you think, yeah, I'm permitted to, or you may pay a fine, but I'm not going to. It's within my rights to refuse a request, of course it is. But you'd only know that if you'd looked at the law dictionary. Now, as the free man movement started to grow, and this started to become more common knowledge, Black's Law produced another dictionary, that was the 8th version, so before they produced the 9th version, the new one, and lo and behold, the word must was no longer in the dictionary, because we'd all been using this to get off parking tickets and so on. So what you had to do this time, though, was go to the word may, where you find that the word may is now defined as being synonymous with the word must, so it still exists. I'm just going to give you a flavour of the law, because that's where my journey led me. Because when you blow the whistle on our terrorist operatives, murdering innocent people, as the innocent people in Libya died, and you are treated as the criminal, you start to think there's something seriously wrong in our society. When the newspapers, when I blew the whistle, journalists called what I said, the deaths of innocent people, collateral damage. Collateral damage! Can you imagine that? You may want to go to them and smash their children in the face and say, do you call that collateral damage? No. It's suffering innocent people. And it's got to stop. People like you cannot carry on being psychopaths like this. And so my experience took me on an extraordinary journey. I've been to prison twice. They tried to kill me on about 8 occasions. Seriously, when I was an atheist, I used to joke that someone up there likes me. Now I'm a believer. I actually believe the only reason I'm still here is because someone up there was protecting me at the right moments. And believe me, I've been in 4 car accidents, subject to 2 food poisonings, and even subjected to germ warfare in the form of meningitis. A form of meningitis that didn't exist in France at the time that I caught it nearly, and my girlfriend went down with it seriously and spent 2 weeks in intensive care because we were standing up to the intelligence services. But we had the French health service phoning us up saying, where have you been? Which countries have you been to? Have you received people from these countries? Because that strain of meningitis did not exist in France at the time. So when people tell me I'm a conspiracy theorist, that this was something that the intelligence service has done to me, that is the evidence I can quote. I clearly didn't actually catch this because it didn't exist in France. So I had to actively introduce it to us. Now obviously as a result of my journey, and having been an ex-intelligence officer, when I was first approached by the 9/11 Truth Movement, I would newly become spiritual and taken a new view. This was clearly my destiny. The first thing I asked to see from 9/11 Truth Movement was, where's the forensic reports? Where are the air crash investigations? I'd worked on the Lockerbie issue. You don't remember Lockerbie, 21st December 1988, 270 people were killed when a paddock was blown out of the skies. I'd worked on that case. So I'd looked at the air crash investigation, which is a public inquiry. I'd actually been to the hangar to see the reconstructed PA-103 flight, because people were bringing in bits of metal for years afterwards. And you can see the basic shape of a plane. So on 9/11, we have 4 planes. 4 planes, we should have 4 air crash investigations. We have none, even though they are required by international law. So in the case of 9/11, the people who've broken the law are the people who have failed to investigate it properly. Clearly, from the word go in 9/11, no one was doing a proper investigation because it would have pointed in completely the wrong direction. 7 days after John Kennedy was assassinated, they set up the Warren Commission. It took 419 days to set up the 9/11 Commission. I was an investigator in MI5. Any other investigation will tell you time is of the essence when investigating. But fortunately, they haven't managed to cover it up. Because we have the images. We can all look with our own eyes and see buildings coming down in 10 seconds. You don't have to be a structural engineer or an architect to be able to examine the melting point of steel and the burning point of kerosene to know that kerosene cannot even seriously begin to weaken treated steel. These things are patently obvious. They can be taught to an adolescent, to somebody doing O-levels. And yet these truths escape scientists, they escape our ministers, they escape our media. It's extraordinary. But as I was saying, as a result of my journey, I saw something different as well, because obviously they took me to trial. Now, I don't know if people know about my trial. In 1980, I was prosecuted under the 1989 Official Secrets Act. In court, they had to prove I worked for MI5 and said something about MI5 without permission. That is what I was convicted of, basically. And even then, they wouldn't allow me to freely cross-examine the witnesses on the stand, even though they lied in witness statements. They would not let me speak freely in my defence. As I said, I blew the whistle to tell people that MI6 funded Al-Qaeda and killed innocent people, but the judge wouldn't let me mention that to the jury because he knew that the jury knew about that. They were tempted not to convict me. And what I did is I put a trick in there. I very quickly said, I left because I witnessed a crime so heinous that I had to resign. And the jury were all ears. And they wanted to ask questions. So I said, can the jury ask questions, which is their constitutional right? And the judge just said, no. Every time I tried to pick up on a point of constitution, of law, of procedure, or practice, I was shut down immediately. I now know why. Because that what goes in our courtrooms has absolutely nothing to do with law. It is a myth that Magna Carta created the rights of man. The rights of man already existed. They were first written down in Magna Carta as part of our constitutional law. However, Magna Carta gives you two choices. It says, you are a free man who lives under the common law, or you join their society. But if you join their society, you join as a slave. A slave has no rights. So when a slave turns up in a courtroom, he doesn't have all his inherent rights intact. He is turned up there for summary judgment. And they will argue that if you turn up in their courtrooms, you are there for summary judgment, and they can make any decision they like without any recourse. That's what I believe happened in my case, and it's happening in countless others. So what is the solution to this? The solution is the common law. When I was doing my case, I was so annoyed with my lawyers. They were so useless. I honestly thought they were conspiring on the other side. They were so bad. This was a liberty to people like John Warden, who should have been good at defending civil liberties cases. So I did all the research myself. I researched all of their law, not just the Official Secrets Act, and I researched something called the common law. The only thing I didn't realise before trial was something I found out several years later, and that is, it is written into their law that the common law is a higher law. It's written in their law if you know where to look and you know a bit of the legal definitions of words, which fortunately I've been taken to, and I've now produced that research. To be clear, the law exists obviously in Magna Carta. It exists in the 1689 Declaration of Rights. It exists in the oath, because the common law is the law of God. An oath is sworn before God, and all MPs, ministers, judges, they all swear an oath. Therefore, they've all acknowledged the existence of God's law. And what does that law tell us? This law is so sublimely simple. It says, love your neighbour as you love yourself. Very simple phrase. Do as you would be done by. You can teach that to a 5-year-old. Now, this comes from the Bible. Many people have many prejudices against the Bible because they don't understand it. I will tell you, the Bible commands you to do one thing and one thing only, and that is love. All the other stuff that the left going about, say, well, you can stone adulterers to death, or you can do whatever, it says so in the Bible. No. It has to be read in the light of a command to love. To love God with all your heart, mind and soul. If you can't quite do that, you're answerable to your conscience. Place the word God with conscience. If you're an atheist, you'll be in the same place. So when it's given to us in the Bible, there's 2 commands. There's no command. The Old Testament has no commandments, but we know the 10 commandments are not commandments, and we don't need them anyway. You don't murder somebody because you don't want to be murdered. You don't steal off somebody because you don't want to be stolen off. We're back to do as would be done by love your neighbour as you love yourself. So there's 2 commandments. Love God with all your heart, mind and soul, and love your neighbour as you love yourself. On these 2 commandments rest all of the law and the prophets. So that's your law. That is law. The rest of it that's been invented by them is not law. It is all consent. Because the love your neighbour principle includes consent. Some people do things I would want to do in a million years, like work the 40-hour week. But I understand they're consenting to it, so I don't interfere. Let them get on with it. It's consenting. So the love your neighbour principle works on consent. But if you don't consent, they have massive problems. Because as I say, the judges have all sworn an oath, ministers have sworn the oath. So the way forward now is to accept that this society is abhorrent and has totally and utterly failed. To accept that the solutions being put forward by left and right are living in a paradigm that hasn't had any meaning for 30 years, but that is still used by the real powers behind the scenes, the powers that be, to create division and discord so that we don't unite amongst a common truth to get rid of our oppressors. And as David Halpern eloquently showed us, these people are psychopaths. You would have to be a psychopath to wage unlawful war. You'd have to be a psychopath to try and spin the case for war. This is not about deciding who's going to fund the NHS or fund libraries. This is a war And yet New Labour spun their way to a war. That is absolutely abhorrent in itself. But the fact that no one has ever been brought to justice for it shows me that we no longer live in a society truly answerable to law and its people, but in a society answerable to a dark elite. And when I used to say this stuff 10 years ago, because people didn't know about this stuff then, they accused me of being mad. When I said there's orchestrated abuse of children going on, how do you think they blackmail politicians? People would laugh at me and say I was a conspiracy theorist. Now it's all over the place. We know that reports from the 1980s were lost and suppressed. Now again, I would say to you, any normal human being like us, if we got reports about children being abused, we want to do as much as we could to stop that, because we don't want it to go on. We don't want suffering to be in the world. But these people, these psychopaths, don't think like that. They only think about their own power and their own wealth. They would never take a risk to actually expose something like that, because they haven't got the guts or the balls to do it, basically. Because psychopaths are bullies and cowards. When we see all these articles about children being bullied in our press, and the press, no, where's this all coming from? Well, they're learning off our newspapers and our politicians, because they know nothing but bullying and oppression. They don't know anything anymore about the most basic things. Establish truth before you try and do justice. How basic is that? How basic? How must that be understood by 16-year-olds even? And I'll give you a very good example. Suppose we have a situation in which you see a man, he's shooting somebody, and all witnesses say, that guy just shot an innocent man over there, and everybody thinks, right, okay, he's guilty. But when they arrest him, they find out, actually, no, he's not. He was an undercover policeman. He was about to shoot dead a guy who was about to let off a massive bomb. Now, if you didn't take that piece of evidence, you'd think this man was a mass murderer and you'd put him in prison for a long time. That is why we need to examine the truth from all sides before we decide what is just. But if that process of truth establishment does not go on, then we will inevitably do injustice after injustice. This is why it is so important to ram home this message about 9/11 and about things like the banking industry in 7/7, because there's questions there about vaccinations, in fact about the whole pharmaceuticals industry. The funniest story I read in the paper the other day was the government announced that they pay doctors £55 for every dementia patient they diagnosed. Strange enough, diagnoses for dementia went through the roof. Surprised me. But doctors aren't superhuman people. They're human like anyone else. They're bound to make those mistakes. But don't give them that opportunity. Don't pay them £55 to make a diagnosis. They're already paid enough. And diagnosis should be made not subject to the pharmaceutical industry, but subject to good medical practice. And the reason I mention all this is because that society, to me, has gone beyond the pale. You could never reform a society like that. As I said to Richard when I asked that question, he knows as well as I do that when you try and raise this in the mainstream, with politicians or with journalists, you get precisely nowhere. I had exactly the same problem, as I say, 17 years ago, trying to bring this evidence to the government. In fact, when I used a legal route to alert Tony Blair to what had happened, they issued an urgent extradition request and threw me in prison. They denied me access to a lawyer for 48 hours and denied me access to visitors for 2 months. Now, I was one in that situation reporting a heinous crime. And that's partly why I speak out, because I do work on the do's will be done by principle. And I really don't want people to be going to prison for no reason. People being fitted up by the intelligence services and the dark elite. And let's face it, where are we now? We're coming into a general election in which none of the political parties are talking about anything important. And the two most likely parties to win are one that's covering up its role in child abuse, and two, the other one on the other side covering up its role in torture. In fact, it's worse than that, because actually what they're doing is covering up their role in covering up child abuse and covering up their role in covering up torture. Now again, any right-thinking human being would find that absolutely abhorrent and would do everything within their power to stop it. The fact that these people don't do it shows to me that they are either cowards, or they are psychopaths, or that they are consciously on the side of the dark elite and their agenda to subjugate humanity. Now, the reason the law is so important, as I say, it takes you out of their legislation, because they will use that legislation against anybody who stands up to them. We've seen this in, for example, the inquiry in Jersey again, into ritualised, systematic child abuse. The guy who was doing all the investigating, the leading copper, was accused of some terrible corruption, had to be taken off the inquiry, and then it was all shoved under the carpet. So the legislation is not part of freedom, it is part of the control mechanism and keeping everybody down. The common law in practice, love your neighbour, you love yourself, becomes in law a duty of care to your fellow human beings. This means that we must be careful by our actions, or indeed our lack of actions, not to cause harm, loss or injury to our fellow man. That's simple. The reason I know it becomes a duty of care in law is because there's also a piece of case law in their system that shows that the love your neighbour principle comes above a contract. And of course, a relationship with government is a contract. So you can say above that contract is the love your neighbour law. I'm not going to go into it now, people can read it. It's called Donahue versus Stevenson, and the case is still quoted in English courts today. It's part of the compensation culture, would you believe? But that's it being, in some ways, used wrongly. Nevertheless, it's still quoted today, so they can't say it's fallen out of use. It's a current piece of case law, and judges are bound by case law. So again, if you get into court, you've got as far as that. Quote Donahue versus Stevenson at him and tell him that the love your neighbour principle comes above any contract. And therefore, he can only take action against you if somebody is actually claiming harm, loss or injury against you. If it's a corporation in the courtroom, turn around to the judge and say, my opponent hasn't got a leg to stand on. But how do we use this common law then to liberate us? Well, we use the common law, I believe, firstly in terms of affidavits. The highest thing you can do in law is to swear an affidavit. Now, if you're in dispute with someone and you serve that affidavit on them and give them a period of time to respond, if they don't, you remind them, and also remind them at the time that if they haven't responded when you get the third communication off you, they have accepted what is in your affidavit as fact in law. It becomes what's known as stare decisis in Latin, beyond judicial decision. So they can't take it to court anymore. So if the Crown Prosecution Service charges you with some not terrible offence to try and distract you or whatever, issue an affidavit, serve it on the judge, saying, I have not committed any harm, loss or injury, and therefore you can have no jurisdiction over me, or there is no man claiming a dispute against me, because a judge can only decide dispute between two human beings. The common law is the law of human being to human being. Corporations have absolutely no rights under the common law because they are group entities without souls, and they behave like psychopaths. Obviously, you can see that in the case of business corporations, banks, and so on. But it's also the same thing in a trade union. A trade union works in the interests of its members. So it's working in a self-interested way, gathering for itself. What it doesn't have is the qualities that we have as human beings, the qualities of compassion and wisdom and love. That means we don't just grab everything for ourselves at the expense of our fellow human beings. We have some compassion to think that we wouldn't want people grabbing stuff off us, so therefore we don't do it to them. But because corporations have no rights under the law, they can't take action against them. You as an individual human being have a higher authority in law than they do. Now this also has another key issue here. No one can make you act against your conscience. Therefore, when they come to demand the taxes off you, you say, no, I don't believe in you anymore, because you're waging an unlawful war. You've been involved in a coalition with people using torture. You've covered up child abuse. So, I'm sorry, I can't trust you to spend my money wisely. So, you're not getting a penny off me, and I will claim my common law rights. Similarly, you can do this with a mortgage, because a mortgage is usury, and usury is odious in law. This comes from a maxim of law. If you read the history of usury, people know why usury is evil. Sorry, I better just define usury for a second. If people know what the word usury is, making money from money, and it is unlawful for that reason. Because the fastest way of transferring wealth from the poor to the rich is through usury. It's what we're seeing at the moment. The government has printed 375 billion of new pounds between 2008 and 2012. That is 375 billion of new debt. To put that into perspective, it took from 1694 to 1997 to run the debt up to 350 billion in the first place. It created as much debt as within 300 years, plus the national debt as it existed in 1961, encouraging creating new money. So with 375 billion in debt, we're never going to pay it off. The national debt's 2 trillion. So let's not be putting our money and taxes into those coffers because it'll only be wasted and only go to bankers. So 2 things you can do to change this world is to get yourself out of the system, stop paying the mortgage, because at the end of the day what you're doing is causing harm, loss or injury to some of the poorest people in the world, and ageing these rich psychopaths who are waging war and putting chemicals in our bodies through the pharmaceutical industry and from chemicals coming down from the skies and in our food. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, but I want to come on here and say to you, this is not a time of despair. As other speakers have said, people are waking up in their droves, and really, if we cannot expose the truth about 9/11 in a relatively free society with the internet, we really don't deserve to live in a free society. So give me liberty or give me death. Thank you.